People in that situation will often devise ways to substitute money for time. So they will hire somebody, let's say, to lead the services, to read from Torah, instead of reading from Torah, learning how to do it themselves. Or they will make a big donation to the synagogue without actually attending services except on special occasions, right? They will, well, there are various ways people can substitute money for time, and we can all think of rich people who aren't very observant. On the other hand, if you're rich but you don't have a high wage rate, you're rich from other sources. Maybe you inherited the money, maybe you won the lottery. More often, you see people who are retired on a nice pension, right? So their hourly wage rate is very low because their income doesn't depend on what they do by the way of work. Their income is there. And so these people can be expected to spend more time on religious observance than people who are working, right? So these are all sort of implications that flow from the just basic demand theory applied to religion as a good. There's one other implication which I think is very important, and that has to do with the relationship between education and the demand for religion. Marshall Sklair, the sociologist, did a study in the 1950s of American Jews in which he observed that the immigrant generation was Orthodox and very observant. The second generation was better educated and tended to be conservative rather than Orthodox. And the third generation was, or even the second generation, if they were very well educated, the doctors, the lawyers, the university professors, tended to be Reform Jews. Now, anybody who knows about these streams knows that the Reform Jews spend the least amount of time in the synagogue, and the Orthodox Jews spend the most amount of time in the synagogue. And so his hypothesis was that the more educated you were, the less likely you were to fall for this religion hype, and so you would become increasingly Reformed. Well, it doesn't work that way. And in the second half of the 20th century, that whole relationship has been changed. So from about the 1970s on, you could no longer correlate education level with what stream of Judaism you belong to. It just didn't work anymore. And the reason for that is because Sklair, not being an economist, didn't understand how wage rates affected demand. Education level increases your wage rate. And the higher the wage rate, the more it costs to be observant, the time-intensive observances. On the other hand, as incomes rose in the Jewish community, higher incomes meant people were more able to indulge in their religious preferences. And by the end of the 20th century, incomes were high enough so that people could afford to be whatever kind of religious observer met their spiritual needs and their sense of belonging and met their preferences. And so you no longer had that tight link between wages and income that you had in the first half of the 20th century. So education is not inconsistent with being an observant Jew. Secular education is not inconsistent with being an observant Jew, and that we have many examples of that today. But many people that are still back in Sklair's world, in their conceptions, don't realize that. So this is one of these relatively new controversies. So now let me leave demand and go on to production. How do you create a religious experience? the short answer is, prices matter. Just like any production process, you look at factor prices and you look at your objective and you figure out the most cost-effective way of achieving your objective. I want to stop for just a moment and talk and put a little perspective on what we're talking about here. Judaism has a great tradition and it has many lesser traditions. The great tradition is Torah. It's Torah-based. It's based on the Hebrew language. To some extent, also, we could extend it to include Tanakh and even Talmud and some later responsa. But it's Hebrew-based, and this is the core of religious Judaism that all Jews share. That's what makes the religion Jewish. That doesn't change. You can add to it, but you can't change Torah, right? You can add another book, you can add a commentary, but you can't change the original because that's the core. That is not susceptible to economics, to change because of economic factors. The lesser traditions, however, are. Now, the biggest lesser tradition that we can name is Ashkenaz, right? So you know from that we're not talking about tiny things, right? We're talking about large geographical areas, large cultural areas, long time spans. But nevertheless, you can be Jewish even if you're not Ashkenazi, right? But if you are Ashkenazi, there's certain things that you are part of your Jewish tradition. There are melodies that you sing, there are holiday customs, there are foods, there is artwork, there's synagogue structures, there's liturgy, right? There's all kinds of things that are part of the Ashkenazi Jewish tradition that are indeed susceptible to change over time. We talk about differences in Jewish cultures in different social environments, but I will submit to you that economic environments also matter, right? That prices and incomes also matter. The same thing is true of the Sephardi tradition and the Mizrahi tradition and the Ethiopian and the Chinese and the Indian. We have a lot of Jewish traditions that are smaller. Many of them have their own languages, right? And they certainly have their own traditions. I mean, Jews in the Torah are not described as eating matzo ball soup at Passover time. But for many Jews today, that's Judaism, right? These small traditions are very much a part of the way you observe your religion, even though they're not part of the large tradition. And that's what is susceptible to influence by prices and income. Now, a self-produced good is any good that you can't just buy off the shelf, right? You buy inputs, and inputs can be anything as simple as a candlestick to a synagogue membership or a Torah scroll. Whatever it is, you buy it, you need money to buy it, right? It's a thing, it's a service. But it doesn't become religious expression just because you buy it. You have to do something. You have to take those candlesticks and light them in a certain time, in a certain context, and with a certain blessing, and then they become religious. That's the religious experience.